Welcome, everybody, to this Policy Lab. I'm really happy that we're together this afternoon to discuss what to do about Oslo, how to move beyond Oslo, how to get out of the mess that we're in and put ourselves on a trajectory to a future of freedom, justice, and equality. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Nadia Hijab, and I'm the co-founder of Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network. And with me today are Sam Bahour, who's a development consultant, a business development consultant who specializes in information technology and startups. And also Amal Ahmad, who's an economist who focuses on the monetary and fiscal relations, if you can call them that, between Israel and Palestine. I want to say that Sam has written a really thought-provoking piece, a co-authored piece for Al-Shabaka a couple of years ago that shows, on ICT, that shows how Israel keeps Palestinians on a drip in terms of technology prevents access to even things like G3 or G2, all that is negotiated. It's a terrific piece. I recommend going to the Shabaka site and reading it or rereading it. And Amal has also written a really brilliant piece on how Israel has used Oslo and the Paris Protocol to create and maintain a no-state solution, which enabled it to do everything it has done now. I say this because I want to encourage those of you who are not yet signed up to Al-Shabaka's email list to do so. It's very easy to do so. You just look down at the bottom of the screen and it says sign up. So without further ado, let me explain a bit about what we're going to be doing today, which is we're going to start by looking at where Oslo went wrong. And of course, we could take the whole hour to do that, probably the whole week. But each of our speakers is going to speak for about 5 minutes, and I'm going to be a bit tough because then we're going to have questions and discussion with the audience on where we went wrong with Oslo. And then in the second half of this policy lab, we're going to move to the discussion of how do we get from here to there? How do we move to a post-Oslo future? The reason we call it a policy lab, by the way, is because we really want to understand and build strategy and policy together for both the short term and the long term, bringing us all together to debate these ideas. So without further ado, let me turn to Sam to kick us off.
Thank you, Nadia, and welcome everyone. Thank you for joining. The question that was posed to us is what damage that Oslo has done. And if to start from there, I can put a couple very key points, even though I should note that others are also addressing this question in the public space. One in specific is an Israeli journalist, well-known Amira Haas, who wrote an article in Haaretz called "With Oslo, Israel's Intention Was Never Peace or Palestinian Statehood." So I encourage people also to see the long list of issues that she has identified as where Oslo caused damage. For today, I'd like to focus on the first one, which is an overwhelming one, which is geographic integrity of the occupied territories was not only disrupted, but structurally changed. What I mean by that is the Israeli military forcefully has divided the occupied territory. The big one that we know about is between Gaza and the West Bank. But there are many smaller divisions that have taken place, many of them below the radar, such as both Gaza and the West Bank from Jerusalem. And within the West Bank, north, south, and west are divided. And then within each of those areas, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of Israeli military checkpoints that divide villages from cities or divert traffic to sometimes an hour drive where villagers used to go 10 minutes to Nablus, for example, to do their shopping and their daily affairs. So that geographic integrity being broken has huge ramifications. The big one I like to talk about is even in terms of universities. We have over 13 universities and dozens of colleges in Palestine, many more than we need. And that's partially due to the fact that in order for higher education to reach the various fragmented parts of our population under occupation, universities had to pop up. And that's easier said than done, because given we live in a closed, occupied area, the Israeli military controls who comes and goes in and out of the occupied territory, which means these universities cannot easily bring in foreign teaching staff or Palestinian scholars from abroad. So the more universities that pop up in Palestine, the more we are cannibalizing the human resource pool for that specific sector. And then you can make the same example on many various sectors across the board. So that would be the first item I would point to. The second, which is partially related, is the political division that happened, yes, between Hamas and Fatah, the known one, but also between many of the parties which are members of the PLO and the PLO leadership itself. All of that political division would be fine if it was brought into a pluralistic national institution that knew how to deal with division and various points of view, which is normal and healthy. The division we're talking about is a division which not only creates disruption in the leadership circles and the institution itself, but also division amongst who controls what geographic area of the occupied territory. So political division would be the second damage that I would point to from Oslo. The third, and I have four, would be that the Oslo process, and I don't think this was premeditated, I think this is something, from the Palestinian side at least, it's something that maybe we fell into this trap, which is a class has been created which has now aligned its interests with the interests of the occupation itself. And this class is the same class which is responsible today, for better or for worse, for the national responsibility of leadership. They are the political agency, and that makes their attachment to an Israeli set of interests very problematic. And the last one, and I'll only touch on this because Amal is an expert here that can speak greater to it, is that the occupation through the Oslo process was able to entrench our economic dependency on Israel, not more in terms of value, that's for sure, but more in terms of structural dependence. And telecom, which Nadia mentioned at the outset, which is a sector that I help contribute to here, is a prime example. 3G, which is an outgoing technology in the world has actually entered 5G for data on mobile phones. 3G was only allowed to be used by Palestinians 6 months ago. After a 12-year battle with everybody in the world getting involved in it, Israel released the technology as it became obsolete. That's a big thing, because that means the Palestinian private sector has to decide to invest $20, $30, $40 million to create infrastructure for something that's already expired, not knowing when the Israelis will release the newer technology to allow us to invest even more. So those are the areas I would point to as clear damage areas coming out of Oslo.
Thanks very much, Sam. And just before we turn to Amal, I want to encourage you to go in and ask your questions, because the people who ask the most popular questions will get them answered. So we have a very interesting list of attendees, and I'm sure you all have a lot on your mind. So please go in and ask questions just by clicking Ask a Question at the bottom. So Amal, we now turn to you.
Thank you, Nadia, Sam, and thank you everyone who's joining us. So what I want to address is just briefly, where did Oslo go wrong? And then I want to touch on the impact it has had on the Palestinian economy. So Oslo went wrong because of a lack of strategic thinking and planning by the Palestinian leadership. The one thing that the leadership and the Palestinian polity as a whole definitely got right and still gets right is that Israel is in no way prepared or willing to integrate the Palestinians into Israel proper in the form of, one state. However, the grave mistake back then and also today was to assume that the only other alternative for Israel was to delink from the Palestinians completely in the occupied territories in the form of two states. With this assumption, when it seemed like the opportunity presented itself with the Oslo Accords, with Israel proclaiming an interest in a two-state solution, Palestinian negotiators jumped at the opportunity. They took this proclaimed interest at face value, and they worked with the understanding that if they normalized relations with Israel and if they conceded claims over historic Palestine, they will be heading a sovereign state in 5 years. Unfortunately, the Palestinian side failed to foresee the now evident possibility that despite any other statements to the contrary, Israel may have wanted a third alternative, one that involves neither one or two states, but a type of, you can call it a no-state solution, whereby the status quo is simply managed and the Palestinians are contained in perpetuity. Now, why Israel would want something like that is up for debate, but I think it's because it safeguards Israel's ability to maintain differential rights for Jewish versus non-Jewish people in the land under its control. So accordingly, we failed to strategically think about what signing the Oslo Accords would mean in such an eventuality. And I think that's where the disaster was. So if you actually go and you read the Oslo Accords, which are actually not that long, you realize that Oslo did not drastically change a lot of the institutions that govern Palestinian life. So as outlined in a brilliant article by Professor Asim Khalil for Al-Shabaka, which I encourage everybody to read, a lot of the governance structures like municipalities and councils and religious institutions that oversaw Palestinian communities changed very little with Oslo, despite the fact that obviously there was something new created called the Palestinian Authority. With respect to the economy, Oslo also introduced very little that was new. Actually, most of what it did was it formalized the existing monetary and customs union that had been around for decades prior. Now, I'm saying this because what I want to get at is what these continuities in Oslo imply depend on what you think the end game is. So if you think that the end game is two states, then it may make sense to think of these continuities as simply some sort of interim stage paving the way to something fundamentally different later, which is what the Palestinian leadership took it as. However, if the end game is perpetual containment, then it becomes clear that these continuities, what they do is they intensify the status quo and they give legal cover for its perpetuation. In that scenario, then Oslo would be catastrophic for the Palestinians, and that's what ended up happening. So my point in this is to say that the outcomes of Oslo depend fundamentally on the underlying strategic interests of the parties involved. Regarding the impact of Oslo, and I'll just talk about this extremely briefly, one can talk about a variety of issues, but one important thing is the economy. Oslo is very damaging to the Palestinian economy, not because of anything new that it introduced to the scene, but actually because it did the opposite. It formalized and entrenched the pre-existing arrangements, primarily the monetary and customs union. Now, these arrangements are extremely damaging to the development of a productive sector in Palestine, and hence the generation of employment and livelihood, largely because they tie the Palestinian economy to the policy preferences and the policy priorities of a much more advanced and dissimilar economy, that of Israel. On a final note, these economic arrangements that were sustained by Oslo and made permanent are not politically neutral. They have been candidates for longevity precisely because they accommodate that sort of no-state no-state situation where you don't have hard borders, but you also don't have integration. Mm-hmm. So they too, these economic systems, just like the Oslo Accords that made them permanent, are fundamentally tied to the Israeli interest of extending the status quo and making it permanent.
Thank you very, very much, Amal. Thanks for reminding us that, of course, there was 25 years of occupation or 26 years of occupation before Oslo, and that Israel was able to use this to its advantage, and that the PLO leadership had completely misunderstood the Israeli strategic interest, or as you pointed out, it was too weak to question it. I want to note that many of you are watching this from Facebook Live or YouTube, and you can also ask questions. So if you just go down to the description box and click on the link in the description box, you can post a question there. And of course, those of you who are on Crowdcast, just go down to the bottom of the screen to ask your question. And while you're at the bottom of the screen, take the opportunity to join our email list. Very easy, made very easy for you. Okay, so I'm going to, and thank you again for really sticking to time, because now we're about 15 minutes into the policy lab, and so that gives us plenty of time for discussion. I want to put this question to you, Sam. It's from Philip, and he asks, is there anything positive that has come about as a result of the Oslo process that's worth trying to salvage in a future post-Oslo? Because I know, Sam, that at one point you mentioned we shouldn't overlook the positives of Oslo, and there was a big gasp in the room at that concept that there are positives of Oslo. So I'll put that question to you, and then Amal, of course, if you want to add something, just say so, and we can give you the mic.
Thank you, Nadia. Definitely, that's a great question, because I have an answer for it. I had thought about it beforehand. I do think that there are issues that, looking in hindsight, of course, I mean, these are not things that were designed into the process. I also think the damages, as I noted, that we mentioned, many of them could not have been foreseen prior. And I should note here why. We have to put this 25 years of Oslo within a historic frame. When the PLO entered this Oslo process, it did so from a point of weakness. It had taken a decision with regards to Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, which created strife within their relationship in the Arab world. And at the same time, they were coming on the heels of an intifada, the first intifada that the Palestinian homegrown leadership was taking the lead of. And the traditional institutional leadership felt that they had to enter to play a role. And given they were not in the occupied territories, playing the role was negotiating. So there is a historical frame why we got into this mess that I think requires a little bit more analysis. Having said that, what do I think is good to think about now that we are witnessing, hopefully, the final collapse of Oslo intellectually? It collapsed realistically a long time ago. The first is this process of 25 years exposed, as Emma noted, Israel's real intention of not allowing another state to emerge between the Mediterranean and the Jordan River. And that's clear on so many different fronts, not only on the political front, but even on the economic front in its relationship to how it allows us to access our natural resources, our land, our water, our petroleum. Israel is not allowing us to build another reality on the ground. I'm not talking about a state. Even below that, something less than that, another constructive reality to change how people view the future. Just the opposite. Everything they've done has allowed people to see the future in a very bleak way, to the point where some people, a lot of them in Gaza, are equating life with death. So that Israel's real intention is the first thing which has come to the light. So anyone who had a misnomer that they were interested in allowing a state to emerge, I think has plenty of material now to see that's not the case. The other good, if we can call it that came out of this, is that it provided an impetus for the Palestinian National Liberation Movement to take the case of Palestine back to the annals of the international community and codify Palestine. It can't create it on the ground because it doesn't have a military force, and the stars are not lined up for us to be able to do that yet. However, we were able to not only codify Palestine, but to get the majority of the world's countries to accept Palestine and upgrade us in the UN and start to deal with us more like a state. That should not be underestimated, as little as it may be in the bigger picture. It is something that didn't come overnight. The third is, again, for those that needed more convincing, and the Trump administration has hit a home run here, it has proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the U.S. is not only not a neutral mediator, but it has total bias for the other side, to the point today where we can see where the Trump administration is administering and implementing a right-wing settler Israeli agenda.
Okay, thanks, Sam, for that. gives us some insights into what we can take and move ahead with. But I want to turn to Amal with a question that was posed, and Amal, feel free to add to Sam's, but maybe just go straight to this other question. I want to go to Amal with a question that was posed by Hamada that says, don't you think we already live in one state before and after Oslo, and that we need to end the one state by dissolving the one state apartheid reality, by dissolving the PA, because the apartheid is hiding itself behind it, and asking for one democratic state and equal rights for all people between the river and the sea? Well, that's over to you.
Thank you. So, I mean, that's a good question. I think when I say one state, or a lot of people say one state, what we implicitly mean is a state where everyone is citizens of that state. So something like what we have now is not one state, because Palestinians are controlled by, in the occupied territories, are under a military occupation, but they don't vote. They're not citizens of that state. So if what we're talking about is a one state democratic equal rights for all, then this is not what we have right now. What I use the no state as a terminology, I think it is clearer because it shows the statelessness, and that's really the critical thing. We're not part of a sovereign Palestinian state, and we're not part of an integrated Israeli state. We have neither, and that's why we have no state and we have no rights. That's what I mean. I hope that clarifies the terminology.
Mm-hmm. But how would you, just thinking ahead, or if you like, we can leave this till the second segment, but how would you end this one state reality?
You mean end the current? Yeah, so I'm going to talk a little bit about how do we move forward, and I'm going to touch primarily on the approach that we use, the type of strategic thinking that we use, how we can leverage our strong points, how we can avoid using things that we are weak in, and how we can operate within the constraints that we're under right now. So this is something that I'm definitely going to touch on in the other half of the policy.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fine. So we'll wait until then. So we're done with that question. Now let's see. There was another question here that that I thought was interesting, which I can't find. Okay. So what needs to happen for Hamas and Fatah to actually conclude the reconciliation process and set up a unified national front vis-a-vis Israel? And I'll ask Sam to answer this. I should mention that Sam is actually in Palestine. Amal is in the United States, and I'm halfway between in London, and that this is the Palestinian reality. We're everywhere. And that's why the work of Al-Shabaka is really so important, because it brings us together to strategize and develop policy and strategy across borders. So Sam, do you want to answer that? What needs to happen for Hamas and Fatah to conclude reconciliation and set up a unified national front?
I wish I knew exactly. I don't. However, there are some things that we should keep in mind. Our national liberation movement has not been dwindled down to Hamas and Fatah. It is a much broader movement. I would actually say that the assemblies that we should be looking at have not been allowed to assemble yet because our political system is not operative. What do I mean by that? Our community across the globe is a young community, and most of the younger generation, it could be even 2 generations now, do not know what the PLO is. They don't know what an operating environment of governance for the liberation movement is, which means we don't know exactly all the political thought within our community. Thus, I would say as a second step, or a second degree approach, would be the political parties that are currently members of the PLO and some of the assemblies which are movements around the PLO must become much more aggressive in holding both of those major parties accountable. it makes no sense that we are all waiting as individual citizens, but also as other political parties, kind of like on the sidelines, as these two parties are at each other's throat. I'm not sure that there's a model where either side, Hamas or Fatah, will accept pluralism within the governance system of the Palestine National Liberation Movement unless they're forced to do so. And being forced to do so will require the other political parties to act, and we as citizens to raise our voices and become much more aggressive, calling for our political system to become operative, not only for those parties to come together, but for Amal's generation to be able to find themselves as leadership within the Palestinian liberation movement, which they don't have the opportunity for today. Thus, our youth are in the street. And the street is fine, but that's not where policy gets made. Policy needs to get made in the chambers of governance. So I hold the party in charge today, the parties in charge today, for not opening those doors of those chambers so we can all have a chance to define Palestinian policy in a formal way.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, thanks. Thanks very much, Sam. There is one last question for this segment, and I'll ask Amal to take that on. It's an unusual question, not the usual kind we get. It's from Ethan, and the question is, do you believe that Palestinian workers should try to unionize and fight for their labor rights in the settlements and within the Green Line if it is a one-state reality or no-state reality? In other words, is part of the fight for equal rights, does it include labor rights even in the settlements? So that's a really challenging one.
That's a really great question that I actually have not been asked before. I think absolutely the fight for rights also includes the fight for labor rights, including laborers who work in the settlement, Palestinians. However, the thing when we talk about fighting for example, labor rights, we have to think, what is the bargaining power of those laborers, right? So if they have no alternative to work in the settlements, what can they use to fight for improved conditions or improved wages, etc., in those settlements? Because usually when you fight for labor rights or when you unionize, you have good alternative options, right? You either have protection from the state, you have alternative opportunities, you have large countrywide unions that you can work with. And I think, unfortunately, in the case of Palestinian laborers in the settlements, they don't have any of that, and they certainly don't have any bargaining power, because the reason that they go to work in the settlements to begin with is because that's literally the last option they have, and we all know that. And we also know that Israel can always just say, you know, we're going to bring foreign workers from elsewhere to do this cheap labor if you don't want to do it. So that becomes the really tricky thing. This is not to say that Palestinian laborers should not fight for equal rights everywhere they work, but that is to say that it's really tricky because of how weak Palestinian labor is, particularly the labor that works in the settlements. And this is especially because we don't have a productive economy that provides opportunities for unskilled labor. You know, we have some job opportunities for qualified labor in the Palestinian territories, but when you don't have an agricultural sector and you don't have a manufacturing sector that's vibrant, that's where you would absorb unskilled labor, and we don't have that. So that's kind of the difficulty of bargaining for labor rights in this context.
Right. Thanks, Amal. Great answer. There's also the issue of normalizing relations without actually achieving a system that provides equality, freedom, and justice for Palestinians, and accepting effectively being second-class citizens with a limited amount of rights. But that was a really great answer. I want to move us to the second part of this discussion, and please keep your questions coming, by the way, and please do sign up for our email list. And if you're on Facebook Live or YouTube, remember you can ask questions by clicking the link in the description box. To go to the second segment for us, how do we move to a post-Oslo future? I'd really like to ask Amal this time to kick off, and then we'll turn to Sam, and then we'll go back to you for your questions. Amal, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So I think, how do we move forward? First, I don't have any, we have to do X, Y, Z. I don't really think it works like that. I think it's a complicated thing and it needs a national dialogue, but just a few pointers here. So first, it's important to reflect on the past collectively, to learn from our mistakes and to not repeat those mistakes. So the main point, which may now be a moot point, but that I'll say and verbalize anyway, is that the permanent containment situation is where Israel wants us to be, so the no-state solution, and it is definitely a viable and sustainable option for the Israeli state, at least in the medium run. Furthermore, it's driven by Israel's desire to safeguard the system of differential rights, which you can call apartheid, in the area under its control. This is what we must think about, in my opinion, whenever we think about next steps in counter strategy and moving forward. Now, second, we must appreciate the constraints that this adverse situation imposes on us, and we must choose strategies and actions that both leverage our strong points and get around or weaken the constraints. So let me explain what I mean. One of the major problems we have right now, and this has been touched upon by Sam and one of our audience who asked a question, is a weak and compromised leadership. So one can even go ahead and say absence of leadership. Now, of course, this means we need different leadership. But until then, and so that we can be effective and not just running in circles, this means we need to adopt strategies and tactics that do not require a central leadership to be operative. And I think this is one of the reasons why rights-based approaches like BDS have been very successful. They can be done at the community level, at the individual level, locally or internationally, without needing to be subjugated to the whims and weaknesses and constraints of the Palestinian Authority. So in fact, I think that an approach that puts human rights demands for equality front and center of the Palestinian struggle is one of the strongest remaining points of leverage we have. So like I said, it gets around the problem of absent leadership. It works to reverse the fragmentation of the Palestinian people between Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, Israel, and the diaspora by giving them a unified demand for human rights and equality. It resonates everywhere in the world, the rights-based discourse, and most importantly, I think it constitutes the perfect counter-strategy to Israel's strategy of permanent apartheid. It exposes the real issues at stake, which are differential versus equal rights, instead of obfuscating and instead of getting us lost in rabbit holes of final political settlements. Now, of course, the really tough question is, what does a rights-based approach look like beyond BDS? Because it can't just be BDS. And I think this is what we need to discuss as a collective on a national level. And to that end, I just want to conclude by talking a little bit about where I don't think we have enough leverage moving forward. And that is, unfortunately, the economy. So the main arrangements that have the main economic arrangements that have governed the occupied Palestinian territories for the last 50 years have endured because they accommodate and they align with the no-state solution. Now, most other economic arrangements, they would require either two separate states or one state, one unified state. Therefore, it is kind of futile to discuss them as alternatives as long as these political prerequisites of either two states or one state are realized. So what I mean by this is there's often a lot of discourse about, okay, well, we don't like the customs union, it's bad for our economy. What about we think of a free trade agreement? The problem is a free trade agreement can only operate if you have two separate sovereign countries. So until we have that, or until we think there's reason that we can expect that in the near future, it doesn't make sense to think about customizing a free trade agreement for Palestine. So another thing is, I've heard, and I think it is nice to think about things like economic resistance, for example, in the form of local food production and sufficiency. However, it's very, very challenging to say how that can be successful when Israel not only controls everything we import, but it controls the main inputs into agriculture, which are land and water. So just to summarize, I think it's best to just understand that a viable, productive economy is simply not possible with the no-state solution, and to prioritize economic relief for Palestinians in the meantime to support their steadfastness as they challenge the current political situation and try to change it. So I think we're more likely to achieve a viable economy as a result of successful politics, as opposed to a viable economy as a precursor to successful politics.
Okay, great, Amal. Thank you very much. We turn now to Sam.
Thank you. Very well said, Ahmad. I would start by saying that we first and foremost must remain aligned with international law and UN resolutions. For better or for worse, that includes a two-state solution as a model of how to exit from the state of affairs that we are currently in. Why do I say that? Because I think going forward, it's not every single Palestinian opening up a menu and finding 10 different options and picking the one that he feels or she feels like they would like to entertain today. One state, two state, no state, confederation, federation, sovereign, parallel sovereignty. There's so many different political arrangements that can happen. The political agency of the Palestinians, as weak as it may be, and this actually happened prior to the Oslo process, the one they chose is a two-state solution, which is aligned with international law, and not only that, with states of the country's policies as it relates to us. So I think there's power in that alliance with the rest of the world. And I say that not because two states is the most just, or maybe not even the most viable. It's because it is aligned internationally with a third reference, parameters of the United Nations and not the parameters of us or the Israelis. And I think there's strength in that. And I actually say it rather comfortably because I don't think Israel is going to allow one state, two state. What they may allow is the no state solution that Emma spoke about. That doesn't mean we shouldn't drop our political articulation moving forward because we are a political conflict par excellence. And I think that's the first thing. The second key point moving forward, and I noted this a little bit previously, is that we cannot move forward without an operating political system. And that means every Palestinian, no matter where they reside, under occupation or in Ohio, they need to step up and say, we will not allow this leadership, whoever that leadership may be, to speak for us without us being represented. And I think we as a community across the globe can do a lot more in rocking the boat. And instead of most of our community, including those under occupation, sitting and complaining about the leadership, we need to engage our civic life into actually holding them accountable and almost forcing our presence within the system so it can start working again and maybe be reset. Thirdly, we must engage, and I think this is something Oslo taught us. We can't do this by ourselves. This is not an issue that the people under occupation can deal with and look at the rest of our people as secondary or not involved. We need the entire weight of the Palestinian communities across the globe involved, not only politically, but also economically, socially, and otherwise. We need all of our expertise, and I work in the economic realm. I fully agree with Amal. We are not going to come out of this conflict via an economic vehicle. But we do need to support our economy today. There's 4.5 million people in the occupied territory, Gaza and the West Bank and East Jerusalem, that wake up every morning. They love, they get married, they go to school, they open homes, they want to have companies, they get educated, they need to work after education. Actually, 30,000 people graduate every year. If we don't do our best to create livelihood for that community, then Israel will succeed in either pushing us out of the country, individual by individual, or turning us violent. The third option they have is that we remain subdued and go to the settlement and build the settlements for them. So we have a national responsibility to serve supporting those under occupation. And another area I'm involved in, it's not economy, it's mental health. The Washington Post had a great article about Gaza about a couple months back. Title of the article, Gaza sustained 3 wars. Now mental health is killing them. So there are a lot of things that are not in the headlines that require our entire Palestinian community to engage in. One last point.
Very brief, though.
We as a community must engage the solidarity community across the globe, especially the Jewish community abroad and in Israel, if there is one, which is aligned with ending the occupation. And to do that, we need to be fully aware that BDS, as Amal said, is not everything. It is one good, strong tool, but it is only a tool within the puzzle of nonviolent resistance. We must embrace the entire puzzle.
Okay, so with that very thought-provoking discussion by both Amal and Sam, let's turn to some of the questions. Let's start by reminding you to post your questions on by just clicking "Ask a Question" at the bottom of the page, or if you're on YouTube or Facebook Live, then by clicking the link in the description. So we have a question here that builds on what was said about Oslo having created, as Sam mentioned, Oslo, this is from Adam. Oslo has created a political class with interests tied to that of the Israeli occupation. So I'm wondering, this is the questioner asking, I'm wondering about the rise also of a major business class with an interest in the status quo. He mentions a specific family who, depending on where you look, owns something like 30% of the occupied territory's economy. What sort of relationship do these large capitalists have with the PA and the occupation? What sort of challenge do they present for any movement for liberation? Before you answer, I am reminded of an excellent Al-Shabaka policy paper that we published about 4 years ago or 3 years ago, and sadly things are still very relevant to that paper, about the Palestinian capitalists who went too far. So if you haven't read it, I recommend it to you. But I'd like both of you to answer this question, Sam and Amal. So let's start with Sam briefly and then go to Amal.
Very briefly, I thank you for the question. I don't think it's news to say that within any territory, here we're talking about the occupied territory, that there is a class which has a business class that has an interest in the status quo. Yes, we do have that. Israel has it as well. That could be one of the major reasons why the occupation persists. It may not all be about politics. It may be about a lot of people benefiting from that $5 billion a year that they benefit from us. In terms of our own community, I am convinced, and I know the players very well, and I know a lot of the stories that might be out there. I'm convinced that any capitalist, as narrow-minded as that capitalist may be, would love to have his own country to be a capitalist in, because that's where he can excel. To have an externality called the State of Israel, military occupation, is not going to suffice for that person. So yes, we do have such a reality, but I assume that at points we can walk with them some steps because they want to end the occupation just as much as the person who's not a capitalist.
Okay.
Can I add to that? So I just kind of want to go along with what Sam is saying and say that there's an excellent book that touches on partly on the capitalists that were involved with the Palestinian Authority at the very beginning of the Oslo process. This book is called State Formation in Palestine, edited by Mushtaq Khan. It's a brilliant book. I highly recommend it for everybody. And that book shows how a lot of the Palestinian capitalists that came from the Gulf and the US and elsewhere at the beginning presented a really big opportunity for the Palestinian Authority in terms of investment, in terms of job generation, in terms of, starting a productive economy. And this was something that the Palestinian Authority tried to manage really well at the beginning in the first years. So maybe 94 to 97. What was the main obstacle to these capitalists actually producing positive results with the Palestinian Authority with respect to the economy was Israel, and was Israel stifling any ability to invest in the Palestinian economy, to I think this is a really important point, that we just don't think, oh, any capitalist with the Palestinian Authority is just aligned and is self-interested, and this can't have positive repercussions for our people as a whole. The problem isn't the Palestinian capitalists. The problem is the Israeli occupation. And that's kind of what I think Sam was saying. And another point about people who are dependent on the Palestinian Authority and the status quo, it's not just the elites. I mean, there are hundreds of thousands of normal people who are employed by the Palestinian Authority. And whether they think they're in line with the status quo or not, they are very dependent on the Palestinian Authority and on the status quo. So a major challenge for us is how do we maintain livelihoods for those people, you know, hundreds of thousands of families, while trying to change the system.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Thanks, Amal. And I'd like us, when we think of capitalists, however bad or good they are, to think of them as he and she, and not just as he. So let's move on now to this question that relates to just what you said at the end, Amal, and what you had said previously. That what exactly do you mean by prioritizing economic relief? Is this, do you mean focusing on international aid, which is problematic post-Oslo? And what role, if any, does the international community have in providing this economic relief? This question is from Allison.
So by economic relief, I mean that we support businesses, like Sam said, in the occupied territories. We support any kind of investment opportunities, anything that can generate jobs for people, even things like the inflated public sector and the inflated NGO sector, but with the understanding that this is not really going to transform the Palestinian economy. We're not doing that. We're not trying to support jobs in Palestine because we think this will lead to a productive and viable and sustainable economy. It cannot. It just can't under the current political situation. But what it can do is help people stay in Palestine. It can, and I think, again, this is exactly what Sam was talking about. It can help because otherwise, you know, anyone who has an opportunity to leave is going to leave. So that's what I mean by relief. I don't necessarily mean aid. So even investment in any productive capacity, that doesn't necessarily won't lead to a transformation, but will lead to supporting steadfastness. I think of that as relief. When it comes to aid, it's a little bit of a tricky question because actually we are dependent on aid. Because of the weak and mutilated and deformed structure of our economy under occupation, we are very dependent on aid. So even though this aid is obviously politically motivated, as all aid tends to be, and there is a lot of accurate discussion out there about, you know, these political conditionalities are destructive, etc., the question is, how do you get the donors to change the way they're doing things when you are dependent on them and when you don't have an alternative? So what do you go and say to the donors, change the way you do things or else, you know, or else what? So I think that doesn't mean there's no way to change the way that aid is being done in Palestine, but I think it is it is something we really need to grapple with how to do.
Mm-hmm. Okay, Amal, very, very good, clear point there. Here's a question for Sam from Dina Qaddoumi, from Dina, that says there's been a lot of talk on the state. What about the nation? How does a human rights approach intersect with nationalism? Will Palestinians need to articulate an alternative formulation of self-determination as a state for a people?
I think that is an excellent question. Hi, Dima. I actually can point to a piece of research that has been recently done in another venue that I'm part of, which is the Palestine Strategy Group. We've actually, for over a year, have worked with Palestinian citizens inside the state of Israel and Palestinians in the occupied territory and produced a vision of how the two communities, and this is only a starting point because there's other parts of our community that are currently being brought into the discussion. What kind of agency does that nation have beyond the two political programs that the Palestinians under occupation have, which is statehood, and which Palestinians inside the state of Israel have, which is equality? So there are venues which are clearly addressing this today. It comes back to we can't do this by ourselves. And to do this has many kind of bullet points to it. One is creating a state, one is dealing with the discrimination inside Israel, and one is dealing with the discrimination of our people in the host countries of where they are refugees, for example. So we are definitely now at the collapse of the Oslo process, and with this very weak Palestinian agency in front of us, I think all of us are thinking, how do we reset it where everyone is brought into the realm, regardless of where they physically sit and what their political agenda may be collectively?
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sam. Yeah, I think that's those are very valid points that you've made. I want to remind everybody yet again, sign up for our email list by clicking at the bottom of the screen, and also ask your question. We have 10 minutes left, and we could potentially still get to your question if it's marked as the preferred question for the audience to answer. So I'm seeming to give well, they've all been tough questions, so I'm not going to apologize to Amal for shooting this question her way. But the question is, given the increasing illegitimacy of the PA, what strategies should the BDS movement adopt in the future? And I would, as Sam has said, expand this beyond the BDS movement and just say that BDS, the movement and its supporters and other or organized activism, what strategies should they adopt in future?
So was the question given the decreasing legitimacy of the PA?
I think it was given the increasing illegitimacy.
Oh, increasing illegitimacy.
The question is from Bobby, I should say.
Okay. So I think that we can't put on BDS more than it can handle, right? So in terms of the strategies that BDS would pursue, exactly what it's doing right now, mobilizing people in different parts of the world, universities, towns, cities, council meetings, pushing for BDS resolutions, pushing for boycotting settlement products. I think the BDS movement is doing all the right things. I don't think there's more that it can do. I just think it is constrained in what it can achieve if there isn't this broader rights-based approach that is not limited to BDS, right? So I think the onus is on us to think about how the language of BDS and the language of rights can kind of be propagated into all avenues of how we discuss Palestine, right? And maybe part of that is to think about nationalism, for example, as separate from statehood, right? So Palestinian nationalism does not mean a Palestinian state. It means a collective entity of people who have a Palestinian identity, who demand their human rights. They can be part of an Israeli state. They can be part of any kind of state. So I think that the best thing about the BDS movement is the fact that it can, that it has really set in motion this rights-based discourse. I don't think it can do on its own more than it is already doing. I think the onus is on us to take it further.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's a very fair assessment and very fair comment there. There was a request which I should mention, which has been reinforced by others, that at the end of the Policy Lab, the participants would like us to send them the resources mentioned by Sam and Amal. So if you send us links to those materials, and we'll add to them the resources that I mentioned also, and we'll send them out if there's a way to do that. I'm assuming that there hopefully is a way to do that. So let's see. There is a question here that I wanted to go to. Okay. So the question that's got most votes, so I'll go with that, is by Haggai, and it says, for Israel to change its current policy on Palestine, there needs to be either a significant change within Israeli society, or massive international pressure, or a wide-scale popular movement of Palestinians on the ground. Which of these seems more likely to you today? So I'm going to ask you to answer that, Sam, if possible. Thanks.
Good question. I don't believe there is one way forward. putting it in business terminology, if I was selling toothpaste, I would want a marketing mix, which means I want to be in all channels, on the billboard, in the paper, and social media. If I'm doing a national liberation movement, I want to be in the solidarity, in civil disobedience, in the UN, and calling third states to uphold their obligations under the Fourth Geneva Convention. All of what Haggai mentioned, and more maybe, needs to be managed, and that's where leadership becomes key. What Amal was saying about the BDS movement, I totally agree with. It's not what more they can do, it's how much scope they can get in doing what they do, and that requires the formal leadership to approach BDS and other nonviolent ways of resistance, not only as a slogan in the speeches, but putting budgets and people behind them to manage the process. And I think we can do a lot more on all of these fronts. And again, we can't do it without engaging all of our people. And I hold responsible all of our people, not only those in leadership and not only those under occupation, or the small numbers which are currently engaged, actively engaged. We need to get everyone remobilized. And we've done it before. Before Oslo, during the first Intifada, there wasn't a community around the globe that was not engaged from a Palestinian perspective, the Palestinian communities, in helping in some way, shape, or form. And I think that we've learned a lot since then, and the urgency of acting now is so high that I think the time is ripe for us to double down on all of those fronts to be able to move forward. Not one, we don't have a magic wand, neither is there a silver bullet. There's hard work organizing on all those fronts, including the diplomatic front, in order for us to make progress.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Sam. Okay, so we probably have time for one more question, or maybe 1.5 questions. I'm just wondering if we should move to a current affairs question, or let's move to this one, Amal, for you. Is there any hope for a changed or new Palestinian leadership? And if so, where could it come from? And also, if so, what should it do at this point to counter Israeli interests in the status quo? And achieve Palestinian rights. That you've answered a bit in your previous comments about the status quo. But if you could focus on the where could a new or changed leadership come from?
I'm not 100% sure where a new leadership can come from. It kind of appears that the existing political actors are not, that environment is not at all ripe for new leadership. It's actually stuck in its ways, and this is part of the problem that we face in doing anything with them. A lot of people, when they think about new leadership, they think about youth. And I think youth can definitely take leadership in several parts of resistance, nonviolent resistance in Palestine. A lot of them take leadership over BDS movement actions. People take leadership over, protests in towns and villages in Palestine. Now, whether they can take leadership at the national scale, I'm not 100% sure. And that is because I think, for better or for worse, at this point, we're having a hard time seeing what can come after the PA or instead of the PA. And again, this is because a lot of people are dependent on the PA for their livelihood, and the PA is dependent on Israel for its own livelihood. So whether there can be something fundamentally different at the national level, I'm not too optimistic, which is why the way I try to think about it is, what can we do assuming that this same leadership is going to stay for a while? Okay. And then I think when we can do things to change things a little bit, when things can actually start to improve on the ground, then I think that would open more doors for new leadership to emerge.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much, Amal. And that question came from Mimi. I think we're almost out of time. So again, one last call to encourage you all to sign up for Al-Shabaka's email list And one last plea to encourage you all to donate. There's a donate button at the bottom of the page. It takes money to keep Al-Shabaka going, just like it takes money to keep any other organization going and to do the work that we do, which I'm perhaps a bit biased, but I think is great work. So I really encourage you all to hit that donate button and where's the donate button? Here it is. Hit the donate button, and it's very, very simple to do. Very simple to do, I think. So if it doesn't come up on the screen, then you can certainly go onto our website and go to donate there. Thank you so much again for joining this Policy Lab and making it such an interesting and gripping conversation. And thanks very much to Amal and to Sam for making the time to come on for this. All right then, and see you next month at the next Policy Lab, which I believe is going to deal with the Palestinian narrative and discourse.